Good evening, and welcome to the Robert J. Dole Institute of Politics at the University of Kansas. My name is Ella Rooms, and I serve as the Programs and Digital Content Coordinator here at the Institute, and am also a member of the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board, the official student group of the Institute. Across campus, I'm a research assistant and peer mentor, a member of Delta 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 National Women's Fraternity, a Rock Chalk Review Director, and am involved in KU Theater and Dance. The Dole Institute of Politics strives to promote a new era of leaderships that uses politics to bring people together through opportunities that emphasize bipartisan cooperation, public service, and civic education and engagement, all of which is inspired by the leadership and service of Senators Bob and Elizabeth Dole and the enduring civic contributions of the greatest generation. The Student Advisory Board is an integral part of this mission, providing members with experiential learning and job opportunities, access to financial assistance, and networking opportunities with our special guests. If you are a student here at KU and would like to join, please email us at dolesab@ku.edu or speak with the student worker after the program. Before we begin, there are a few reminders I'd like to take a moment to share with you. Following tonight's program, a video recording will be available to stream on demand on our YouTube channel, where you can access a full catalog of our past programming. A loop hearing system is available to use if you have a T-coil hearing aid. The Institute also has a limited number of listening devices. If you have questions about the loop system, or if at any time you have difficult hearing, please alert one of our staff members. Please take a moment to familiarize yourself with the marked exits in the room. In the event of an emergency, please make your way to the nearest marked exit. Please follow the instructions of staff members and exit the building if necessary. Following tonight's interview, a limited number of audience questions will be answered. If you are part of our virtual audience, you can submit questions via email at dolequestions@ku.edu. The Dole Institute aims to foster civil and respectful discussion around important and often difficult topics. Please phrase your questions with this in mind. Finally, I'd like to remind you to please silence your cell phones or place them in Do Not Disturb. Now, please join me in welcoming Director Audrey Coleman.
Thank you, Ella, for that warm welcome. There's almost nothing better than the kickoff of a new programming season every fall. Welcome to everyone who can join us here this evening. We see lots of familiar faces and friends and lots of new faces, and we're so glad you're here with us at the Dole Institute. Thanks for being a part of our vision that politics is an opportunity to connect across differences. Before I welcome our visiting fellow to introduce our guests, I want to just promote a couple of other opportunities together here at the Dole Institute in the coming weeks. Our fall 2025 fellow is Joni Wickham. She's a political consultant that served as chief of staff to Kansas City Mayor Sly James. Her public service career also includes work with the American Federation of Teachers, Missouri Department of Transportation, and with Missouri Secretary of State Robin Carnahan. She will host our discussion group series, Leadership Lessons from the Front Lines of Public Service, focusing on topics in local governance, including mayoral and representative leadership, public advocacy, and local policy making. Her first program will be on Wednesday, September 10th at 4 p.m., and her first guest will be none other than former Mayor of Kansas City, Missouri, Sly James. So you won't want to miss that opportunity. And then please plan to come back on September 24th, October 8th, and 22nd, and November 12th for more conversation with Joni. On September 23rd at 7 p.m., we'll welcome back Spring 2024 Dole Fellow Karen Willey for Water for Our Future, a bipartisan conversation with legislative members of the Kansas Water Program Task Force, Kansas State Senator Kenny Titus, and Kansas State Representative Lindsey Vaughn, who are examining policy solutions to ensure the state's current and future water supply. Those and many more opportunities, you can find more information on doleinstitute.org on our website. And additionally, this program tonight, we are so excited to announce that we will be broadcast at a later date on C-SPAN, so watch for news on that. Now, join me in welcoming back our friend and collaborator, Dole Institute visiting fellow Jerry Seib. Round of applause. I have some big news for you in a second. You're going to be clapping more when I tell you. But Jerry, as we know, is former Washington editor of the Wall Street Journal. In his 45 years working with the Journal, he served as the outlet's Washington executive editor and wrote the weekly column Capital Journal, reported from the Middle East, covered the White House, moderated 3 presidential debates, and has interviewed every president since Ronald Reagan. I think that's a pretty good resume. And with that in mind, we have a wonderful announcement about a new project that Jerry will be banking on. He has recently gotten a contract with HarperCollins to write a new Bob Dole biography. So we could not be more thrilled about that. Obviously, we are the place for Bob Dole biography and history, so we look forward to supporting him in the archives and in any other way we possibly can. We are so thrilled. The timing couldn't be better. And those of you who are Bob Dole and Dole Institute junkies, you all know that this story is one that must be told and recognized and remembered for new generations to come. So we're so pleased about that, and watch for news on that. So without further ado, I believe that's all of my announcements, and I will turn it over to Jerry to introduce our guests and begin our conversation, church and state. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you. I can never tell. Yeah, this is working. All right. Well, as Audrey just said, first of all, thanks for being here. It's nice to see familiar faces. It's nice to see new faces. And it's nice to be back on campus, which means a lot to me and to Barb, my wife, who's sitting right there. And tonight, the topic also means a lot to us. It's, as Audrey said, the topic is church and state, and specifically the question of what influence Catholic thought is having on public debate in this country right now. And I say this with some trepidation because there's some pressure involved here, because sitting right there is Father Mike Scully, who is the Dean of Students at my Catholic high school in Hays, Kansas. Not just mine, but my 2 brothers. And so we'll try to do it right, and if we don't, you'll have your chance to tell us later. So, but more important, perhaps, I brought the 2 smartest people I know of on this topic from Washington here tonight. Next to me here is Ashley McGuire, who's a senior fellow with the Catholic Association, and a columnist whose work has shown up in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, USA Today, Time Magazine, Newsweek. She's received a lot of awards, including the Phillips Foundation Robert Novak Journalism Fellowship, has testified at the United Nations in defense of the Holy See, and interestingly, has been at the last 2 conclaves, the one in 2013 that picked Pope Francis and the one this year that picked Pope Leo. So thank you, Ashley, for coming out to join us. And James Grimaldi is an old friend, and I'll tell you in a second how old a friend he is. Not how old he is, but how long we've been friends. But he serves as executive editor of the National Catholic Reporter, a 60-year-old award-winning nonprofit news organization that's based in Kansas City, which is important because James is from Kansas City. Unfortunately for all of us, he went to the University of Missouri, so it's odd that he's here in Hate Missouri Week, but it couldn't be avoided. And then he's an alumnus as well of the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. He was an investigative reporter for the Washington Post, and then joined me at the Wall Street Journal. He was a colleague of mine in the Washington Bureau of the Wall Street Journal for years. But more important than all that, I first met James when he was an intern at the Kansas City Star, when Barb and I were assigned by the Journal to go to the Middle East, to live in Cairo and be the Middle East Bureau of the Wall Street Journal. James showed up at Barb's parents' house in Kansas City to interview us for a story about local kids going to the Middle East.
Right.
And I still have that story in my scrapbook at home. So, you know, the topic that we're going to discuss tonight is both important and timely, but it's also one where I think a little bit of an introduction and backdrop is necessary. So obviously there remains a clear separation of church and state in this country, and I don't think anybody would suggest otherwise. It's worth remembering the words of our first Catholic president, John Kennedy, who said, "I do not speak for my church on public matters, and the church does not speak for me." Still, we've arrived, I think, at a point where the question of Catholic influence on public debate and political action in this country is worth discussing. As a backdrop, Catholics are easily the largest single religious body in the U.S. They number some 61 million. And more to the point, tonight, we now have a very heavy Catholic representation in our public and political life in Washington. Our last president, Joe Biden, was Catholic, obviously. Catholic representation is large in the White House, starting with Vice President Vance. Carolyn Leavitt, the president's spokesman, is a Catholic. In the cabinet, there are 7 Catholics in the Trump cabinet. At the Supreme Court, 6 of 9 justices are Catholics. And in the House, 3 of the top 5 Republicans are Catholic, and one of the top Democratic leaders is a Catholic. So across the spectrum, for whatever reason, all of a sudden there's a lot of Catholic representation. And of course, to top it off, we have now the first ever American Pope sitting in the Vatican. So the question, Ashley and James, that arises from all this is an obvious one. Does it matter? How does this influence public policy discussion and public policy action in this country? And Ashley, I'll let you start.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here. It's really exciting to be here and a real privilege. And a topic that I care very much about, and I agree with you, is relevant more than it's ever been. Even before we had an American Pope, there was definitely consensus that the Catholic Church in America is having a moment. There's a real youthful energy to it. There's so many young converts. The presence in media, social media is large and growing. And so it is very much an exciting time to be an American Catholic. I guess I would answer that it matters and it doesn't. I mean, I think there's constantly an attempt to fit the Catholic Church into political boxes, and especially the Pope. And Pope Francis really defied those boxes in ways that were very vexing to people, because he would refer to an abortion as hiring a hitman, but then he would go out and talk about environmental issues in a way that made conservatives bristle. But Catholics really kind of fall pretty evenly on both sides of the political aisle. I mean, and even in their representation in Congress, that's also true. I mean, it's a pretty even divide. So I think to the extent that they're discussing and debating things, a lot of that is actually just still political divides that were already existing. But on the other hand, I mean, there is a uniquely Catholic in Catholic teaching, a real emphasis on bringing your faith into everything that you do into the political realm. So I think, these politicians on both sides are very much, in different ways, animated by their religious belief. And I think we're just hearing more about it because we're continuing to increasingly punch above our weight in terms of our representation, as you pointed out so accurately. I mean, we've had a baptized Catholic in the Oval Office since 2009, which was the year I converted to Catholicism. We now have 6 of the 9 seats on the Supreme Court, and the Speaker of the House has been a self-professed Catholic since, I believe, 2007. So certainly a lot of opportunities to bring to the forefront the intersection of Catholic social teaching with public life.
Yeah. James, I wanted you to answer the same question. I wanted to, though, preface that by, I should have pointed out, you also were in Vatican City for the conclave.
Yes, I was. Yeah, a gift from God.
Yeah, exactly.
Something I've always followed the conclaves and never thought in my wildest dreams I would be at a conclave, and I'm very pleased to be able to cover it. And by the way, thank you for inviting me to enemy territory. MIZ, go Tigers on Saturday. But
does it matter? How does it matter?
Well, I will answer the question this way. I think there's a divide in the U.S. Catholic Church and in the United States that's very much reflected in the Catholics who are in government. So, for example, we have a lot of Catholics who are in the Trump administration right now, who are very much not in line with the Catholics who served in, obviously, the Biden administration. We have Catholics who are in the Supreme Court who would be considered more on the conservative political side. I definitely agree with Ashley that, there can be some conflation and confusion about what is conservative and what is liberal. I will say that there is a movement within the Trump administration I believe, to actually try to influence the U.S. Catholic Church. And how so? Well, there's an embrace, in particular, of an institute called the Napa Institute, which is funded by a multimillionaire by the name of Tim Bush. And they have gone out through the United States trying to sort of bring back some of the more traditional thinking in the Catholic Church. They are very much behind this Religious Liberty Commission that Trump has appointed, and appointed Bishop Robert Barron to be a part of that. And a lot of that movement is wanting to move back to the Latin Mass and more traditional values. And I would say that many, and including a group called Catholic Vote, which was run by a man who's now the ambassador to the Vatican, very much were in Vatican City, and we covered this at the time, trying to promote a different track, a course correction in the Vatican. And I think they were pretty sadly disappointed with the appointment of Robert Prevost, because he pretty much from the very day that he went onto the loggia at St. Peter's Basilica embraced this concept of synodality, which for those of you who don't know is being more open, more welcoming, really flattening out the church, a rejection of clericalism where we put priests and bishops and cardinals on a pedestal and they tell us what to do, and have more discussion. And I think the big disappointment you could probably hear among conservative Catholics happened on Monday when Pope Leo XIV met with Jesuit Father James Martin, who is the probably most divisive, controversial Catholic certainly among conservatives, and the proponent of LGBT Catholic inclusion and the founder of Outreach. Pope Leo met with him, released 3 photos, invited him into the library at the Apostolic Palace, which was sort of the Vatican's way of saying, we endorse that, told him he could come out and say that he endorses his ministry, which is, frankly, one of the reasons that the groups, and there were very, very moneyed, U.S. money interests in the Vatican who wanted to go a different direction, who did not believe in synodality and thought that Francis was creating confusion, was the phrase that they used. So there's a little bit of a parallel between what you're seeing in the Trump administration as well as sort of this division in the U.S. Catholic Church.
So I want to get to the Pope in just a minute, but Ashley, let me ask you to sort of expound a little bit more on the backdrop of what James was just talking about. There's been kind of a tradition or a belief that the split between conservative/Republican Catholics and liberal Democratic Catholics was that the former, the conservatives, stress cultural issues and abortion, and the latter stress social justice and the treatment of immigrants. Pretty oversimplified. I'm not sure liberal and conservative labels mean anything anymore in the political environment we're in, but is that roughly correct, or is that changing?
Well, I certainly think that where you see Catholics who vote Republican align with the Republican Party is on those issues.
Yeah.
And that's because those issues get to the core of Catholic moral doctrine. The truth about the human person, the truth about the family, what is it to be a human? And in this day and age, what is it to be a man? What is it to be a woman? The defense of the dignity of all human life from conception until natural death. This is something Catholics here prayed for at every Mass. On those issues, the Republican Party has been stalwart. Mm-hmm. And those are immutable church teachings. Issues that tend to fall under the umbrella category of social justice issues tend to be more embraced or emphasized by the left. Those, discussions about immigration policy, the environment, an issue that Pope Francis brought to the forefront. Mm-hmm. Those are issues that are categorized as prudential policy matters. These are issues that Catholics, there's no prescriptive, there's certainly church teaching on, what are to be the moral principles that guide Catholic policymakers, Catholic voters when it comes to those issues. But the church is not going to have a one-size-fits-all prescription as to how you're supposed to vote on those sorts of issues. Very crystal clear cut on those social issues. So one thing that's interesting to look at is when you break down Catholic voters into how frequently they attend Mass. This is where the numbers get even higher. If you look at the last couple of elections for, people who voted for President Trump. And I think that's just because those are the issues that tend to be most important to people who are going to Mass every week. So I would actually argue that the breakdown, if you scrutinize the polling more closely, tends to fall more along the lines of how seriously are people practicing their faith? Are they going to Mass weekly, which is one of the most basic prescriptions of being a practicing Catholic, as opposed to political parties?
Yeah. I have the impression, James, but you can tell me if I'm wrong, that the abortion issue, which was the central defining question of Catholic involvement in public policy in many ways for a long time, seems to be fading a little bit from the national conversation because it's moved out of Washington out to the states, and that's created some space for some of the other issues that Ashley's talking about to move in. Am I right about that? Or?
I generally think you are right about that because essentially the argument was won with the overturn of Roe versus Wade, and it's now in the state level. I will say, on the state level, it did come up, as you know, we had a lot of initiatives in the last election, 12 or 14, and we actually had stories where we wrote about Catholic money that went into many of the state initiatives, and in fact, where there was Catholic money that went into the state initiatives, it really fell along the lines of the anti-abortion side. So I will say that there's a little bit of that I generally agree, but I still think that it's predominant particularly among many of the conservative Catholics who are voting. But I don't know that it's necessarily the predominant question anymore because it's not a question on the national stage, and even Donald Trump has really tried to move it away and move it out of the national stage. He's very specifically said it goes to the states, and he doesn't want it to be sort of a national issue. And so in many ways, the leader of the Republican Party sort of dismissed it as being an issue while still being, endorsing the position of anti-abortion.
In part, I assume, because he's never really seemed very comfortable with the subject at all on a personal level.
Well, he's waffled on it over the years. He's kind of flip-flopped and gone back and forth. Yeah. So he hasn't been consistent on that issue from in their statements are sort of earlier on. I think it was even with Chris Matthews. I think at one point there was the video that came up in the last election about it. I think right now, honestly, I personally believe that, for him it's a political calculation, that it was a way to win and build support for, his election for those who see that as primary and predominant among it. I will say that Pope Leo, I believe, I think I would just advise you, if you have some interest, you look at his name. He picked Pope Leo XIV after Pope Leo XIII. Pope Leo XIII, of course, was the author, the creator of Catholic social teaching. And so I think there was definitely a signal there, his statement about synodality. And as I think we've discussed, you may know that a month before he was elected Pope, we had a column in the National Catholic Reporter, which is the headline I wrote, that said, J.D. Vance is wrong. Jesus does not tell us to rank our love for others, which was a debate about a teaching called Ardo Amoris. I'm going to mess that up, but essentially that has to do with 1 Timothy that talks about, he went on Fox News, J.D. Vance, saying that, well, it's okay to deport all of these immigrants because we're told to rank our love first with the family and all the way down into the rest of the world. Pope Francis came out with a statement that basically knocked it back and said that's not what the teaching is. Jesus says that we have love for everyone. Our love is unlimited. Love begets love, and therefore you have it. So I will say I'm proud that the headline that I wrote, that he retweeted, Pope Leo did when he was Robert Prevost, had 25 million views, probably the best read thing that I've ever written. And of course, it was retweeted after he was elected Pope, and the New York Times and others found it. But I think that is an indication of maybe where he's coming from in terms of, his thoughts about where, the policy ought to be. And of course, no one's ever going to be elected Pope unanimous in that abortion is wrong, and so there's no question about that at all. The real question then becomes, is the Trump administration acting as the Catholic teaching would dictate or not? This is a debate that is actually in the church. There are many people who say it may be the most Catholic administration ever, that is the most un-Catholic in terms of its policies.
So, but Ashley, I suspect you don't agree with some of what James just said, but let me just take you to this question of the Pope. Because notwithstanding the meeting with Father Martin, my impression has been that he's treading fairly carefully so far. And I say that because people saw an American Pope and wondered, is he going to start telling Americans what they should think? Is he going to start dictating things to the U.S. government? My sense is he's pretty cautious about those kinds of things and doesn't want to get out over his skis. But you tell me, you know more about it than I do.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I recently saw him referred to as the quiet American. And, that's not what we think of when we think of Americans. But I think he has a very different temperament than Pope Francis. I saw something else, a reference to, he's breaking us of our addiction to papal headlines. And Pope Francis was in the news a lot. That was a space he was very comfortable with. He loved to be in the press scrum. He spoke very off the cuff. Often his Spanish would lend itself to very interesting headlines. So it's been a real change of pace for people who are in the Catholic news media world. But I think that that's been good, and I also sense that he's trying to avoid ruptures. So you mentioned the Father Martin meeting. I mean, he also had a meeting with J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio where they were sitting there laughing. It's clear he's a peacemaker, and he stressed unity several times. It's first time out there in the loggia, and that's something that's really needed right now, I think, for the church, and has been good, and I think has helped Catholics to kind of refocus. And it's clear he's trying to refocus Catholics on, and maybe this is his religious charism is just refocusing our attention on Christ. But no, I mean, Pope Francis was very comfortable being very critical of America and American politics and even American clergymen. Yeah. So this has been different. I mean, it's only been 100 or so days, but we got a very good sense of Pope Francis in this first 100 days, and that's stayed pretty consistent. So it's yet to be seen, but I think that cautious is an accurate characterization.
Do you think, James, he has the potential to, leaving politics aside for a second, does he have the potential to heal rifts within the American Catholic community with this style that Ashley's been talking about?
Yeah, I definitely think that's part of the hope. He definitely has. I would say walks softly and carries a big crozier, which is, some of you may know is the bishop's staff, right? So, I mean, I think he's very clearly identified issues. I have heard that he's really focused on trying to fix the curia, because the curia is made of these departments they call dicasteries, and apparently they were all stovepiped and none talked to each other, and he was a product of one of the dicasteries. So I think he may be working internally before he goes outward. Some say that Pope Francis was synodal for the larger church, but he was not synodal in terms of the inside the church. I think maybe Pope Leo may be trying to be more synodal to try to heal the internal divisions that there may be before going out. But I definitely think that there is some opportunity for him to do that. It will be interesting. I mentioned the Latin Mass. I mean, maybe he could bring that back. Maybe he won't. That's very, very divisive in terms of a question. That was like one of the questions we asked of all. We treated by the way, the conclave like an election. We did a survey of all 133 members of the College of Cardinal, and we looked at every one of their statements to determine how they spoke on everything from LGBT blessings to the Latin Mass to elevating women in the church, and we were able to look through them. The thing that stood out the most was this issue of synodality. And we will tell you that some of the code words you'll often hear from the conservative side in the church is, Cardinal Dole and Bishop Barr and others, we're really looking for unity and clarity. Their statement was, which is a backhanded and a sort of a euphemism for saying that Francis brought disunity and lack of clarity and confusion about, for example, LGBT Catholics. So the question is whether he can bring that. We'll see. He is very unique. You call him the first American. I will correct you and say he's the first U.S. Pope. Many will say Pope Francis was the first American Pope, just so you know, because he was from South America. He only spent a third of his life in the United States, and a third was in Peru, of course, and a third was sort of basically in Europe as the head of the Augustinian order. And so he may have been the most un-American of the American candidates that was there. That may be able to bring him together. Remember, there are divisions beyond just the United States. We have a very conservative prelates who are in Africa, for example. They were probably the most conservative. And we have very liberal cardinals and bishops in Germany, which would make the so-called liberal cardinals in the United States, look very mild in comparison. So there are divisions worldwide, not just in the United States.
So, Ashley, I think one of the reasons we're having this conversation tonight is, and you mentioned the Pope's meeting with J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio. One of the reasons I think this topic is relevant is that those two guys in particular seem willing to cite their Catholic faith as justification for things they believe. Do you think that's going to continue? And in that context, is that going to make immigration the new sort of flashpoint separating liberal and conservative Catholics, not just in the U.S. government, but in the country generally?
Yeah, I certainly think immigration is here to stay for a while as a flashpoint issue. I think that, and I also think you're right that both of those men are very open and public about their faith and the role that their faith has in informing their moral worldview. But as I mentioned earlier, it's no secret that J.D. Vance has clashed with the Bishops' Conference and that President Trump clashed with Pope Francis over immigration. But the truth of the matter is the church is not, they do not have a one-size-fits-all prescriptive policy for immigration. So you're going to always see Catholics disagreeing about how do we fix our immigration problem. I don't think there's anybody who would deny that we have an issue. If not the fact that the issue is that we don't agree as a country about the issue of immigration, and it's really tearing us apart. So I think, to answer your question, yes and yes.
Yeah. James, we haven't really touched on the Supreme Court yet, but in some ways, maybe the most striking fact in the list of Catholic representation at the top of the government is the fact that 6 of 9 Supreme Court justices are Catholics, and those are predominantly conservative Catholics. But again, the question arises, what difference does it make? If you step back from what the Supreme Court has done with those people on the body, has it made a difference? And if so, how?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I could see how it makes a difference except for maybe overturning Roe versus Wade. I think, Trump made it a policy that he said he was going to appoint justices who would overturn Roe versus Wade. That in fact is what they did. I mean, some ways I look at all of the Catholics on the Supreme Court as the success of Catholic education in the United States. Some of the best universities, some of the best grounding people will get is basically in Catholic schools, many of which would, for example, be run by Jesuits, who when I was growing up would be very much in the progressive camp, not necessarily completely always today. So I'm not sure there was an ideological base. It may just be, the fact that they also identified with that particular issue. And I think you can see that the Catholics who are on the Supreme Court very much are in line with conservative Catholics on the hot-button topics, the ones that are sort of the flashpoint. I think when you look at the majority of the decisions in the Supreme Court, most of them really don't even touch on those issues. They get into business and antitrust and a whole raft of things which you probably could not discern anything out of the gospel about how you would decide, a trade dispute, like whether, Trump has the ability to impose tariffs.
Yeah. One of the other issues that the Pope did touch on a few days ago, beyond immigration, was guns. In the aftermath of the Minnesota school shooting, he made this statement, which got a fair amount of attention, that he thought it was time to bring an end to the epidemic of guns, large and small, essentially. Which on the one hand is a pretty anodyne statement. On the other hand, was he talking about gun control? I don't know. What do you think?
I don't know. And I think, to get to your earlier question of his cautiousness, he stopped short of, citing any particular policy or party or person. And I think that was wise. I think. And
intentional.
Yes, exactly. I think, I don't think you'll find a Catholic who would disagree, just as I was saying, that immigration is a divisive issue, that we have a gun violence problem in this country. But, here we are decades later, unable to find a solution. And, that's another one where the Catholic Church isn't going to weigh in and say, this is your gun policy. Conceal and carry is okay. Your gun has to be unlocked and in the, because there's no, the cities with the strictest gun violence problems, that hasn't solved their problem. Was the shooting in Minneapolis more revealing about mental illness than guns? We have a mental illness problem in this country, and so.
Yeah. Do you think at this point conservatives mistrust Pope Leo, or is the jury still out on their point of view? And you can ask the same about liberal Catholics.
I have yet to meet a conservative who mistrusts Pope Leo. I think that he was warmly welcomed by conservatives. I think that he's very much respected and admired and has already grown to be beloved, especially young Catholics. You look at the welcome that he got at the speech that he gave to the Jubilee pilgrims. I haven't seen anything critical about him. So I think
that's my impression too.
Yeah, I think I wouldn't even say the jury is still out. I think it's an innately Catholic impulse to love your Pope.
But you wouldn't have said necessarily the same thing at this point in Pope Francis's tenure.
I actually wrote a piece in USA Today with a Democrat embracing Pope Francis and talking about how he kind of opened my eyes to environmentalism. I recycle because of Pope Francis, He was the first time someone that high up in the Catholic Church brought that issue to my attention.
His first miracle, right?
Further down the road, there was some disappointment or frustration, I think, especially when he criticized conservative Catholics and said something like, we're stuck in a dogmatic box, and there was a little bit of wound there. But no, I think Catholics are hardwired to love our Pope, and so that goes for conservative Catholics too.
Yeah. James, there was I made a note of something that was in your paper about.
By the way, ncronline.org.
Okay. This paid political announcement. At the time when there was this the dispute between Vice President Vance and Pope Francis, somebody wrote in NCR, online and in print, this: Catholic politicians like Vance and other Catholics in the Cabinet, Congress, or Supreme Court are hypocritical when they claim to be pro-life while celebrating the mass deportation of migrants and refugees, urging expansive use of the death penalty, and demeaning LGBTQ persons as unworthy of protection, Trinity Washington University President Patricia McGuire said. It seemed to me that captured a lot of what we're talking about here tonight, which is that's kind of the way liberal Catholics view this constellation of issues, and conservative Catholics wouldn't agree with just about anything that you said.
Right, and that's where I think the disconnect is that progressive Catholics believe that guns are a life issue as much as abortion is. They believe that welcoming all people is sort of a life issue, right? So, the question of how you define of a life issue, does basically a pro-life stance end with, the birth canal, or does it include deporting children to Guatemala separated from their parents, or deporting parents of children who are still here to Nicaragua when their children are still here. I think that the president of Trinity University, the editorial policy of NCR, and many of our columnists would say those are life issues, and that's sort of the difference. And I think that many of our columnists and writers are confounded, or really can't understand the disconnect, and it is a disconnect between Catholic social teaching, pro-life issues like children, and members of the administration. And, ncronline.org referred to the vice president as his thinking as hillbilly theology, which we actually got some criticism for.
No, I'm stunned.
Because he basically sort of mangled that. On guns, I'll talk about this a little bit, which is interesting. We had a whole piece that referred to what Leo said, but also what Supich, the Chicago Cardinal, and Weisenberger in Detroit, which was far more kind of pro-gun control than the rest of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops and the other bishops' statements. And ironically, or perhaps contradictorily, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops since 1975 has been supportive of gun control and more gun control laws. But what oddly, you won't see certain bishops ever talk about that. They will only talk about the the hot button topics that seem to be motivating the Republican Party, and that's confounding to many progressive Catholics.
Well, I'll let Ashley talk here, but I would say I think a conservative response would be that those are issues on which there is no clear Catholic Church teaching, and so there's room for debate, that they're not theological issues. But you tell me.
Well, right, like the example of immigration, I mean, J.D. Vance's response was that having an open border policy has led to a human trafficking crisis that has enabled coyotes and people to exploit children and vulnerable women. So, from his point of view, what they're trying to do is reform the system so that people, likewise, I think he would agree that it is a life issue. And even on the
But he would define the term life differently.
But how does mass deportation related to any of those issues? It doesn't.
Well, I think that I'm not here to defend the Trump administration's immigration policy, but I do think that it is fair to point out that this is an issue where there is space for well-intending Catholic politicians to disagree about the best approach that ultimately leads to the safety of citizens, in addition to the protection of the vulnerable people who are coming across the borders. And his argument would be that our immigration policy to date has not protected anybody. And then, furthermore, on the abortion issue, this is one area where I do think conservative Catholic politicians are changing, in the sense that they really are broadening the scope and emphasizing the family. And, J.D. Vance's speech at the March for Life this year was, he started by arguing that the health of a nation should not be determined by its GDP, but by how, whether or not a family feels like they can afford to have children and to raise them in a fulfilling and safe and happy way. And I think we are seeing a shift in the party that I do think is influenced by the emphasis in Catholic social teaching on the worker, on the dignity of the individual, towards more pro-family, pro-worker policies.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think the Democrats and Republicans are going to come together and think and agree that a pro-family policy includes making affordable starting housing to young families available more widely than it is today.
And paid family leave. I mean, you're not going to see a top-down mandate, but there's a lot of emphasis on...
And you're going to see bipartisanship.
Right.
Yeah. I want to turn to questions from the audience here in just a minute, but let me touch on one other area, which is takes this question beyond the borders of the U.S. I noted, interestingly, earlier this month, Marco Rubio gave an interview to EWTN, which is the Catholic cable network. And interesting that he took an hour of his time to do an on-camera interview with EWTN. I'm not sure that's ever happened before, and says something about the importance of the Catholic faith to him. But he talks some about common good capitalism, which was his view of how the kind of goals economically that you're talking about could be achieved. But he also talked about what the Vatican could do to help the U.S. government overseas in foreign policy. And he said, I think the Vatican could play a very key role in many parts of the world. They're actually very skilled diplomatically. In the end, their number one goal has to be the church and its presence in other places. I know they're deeply concerned about the church being persecuted in Nicaragua. So they're always concerned about the church in China, which has been a point of friction with the U.S. government in the past. He said some things there that suggest something I haven't seen before, which is the U.S. government potentially working with the Vatican on foreign policy issues. Is that a far-fetched idea, or do you see it as something that's plausible in the next couple of years?
Well, I certainly think there's an alignment between this administration and Pope Leo in terms of genuinely seeking peace in Ukraine, in the Middle East, and the picture of President Trump sitting in a little folding chair across from Zelensky in St. Peter's Basilica sort of, I think, really tells the story that certainly the Vatican wants to be a diplomatic force for good. And I do think that there's certainly a lot of opportunity for alignment with this administration that is actively trying to broker peace deals throughout the world.
Thoughts?
Yeah, I think that was to me like riveting, that scene in St. Peter's Basilica. The Vatican diplomatic corps is one of the best in the world. They always have been. It is interesting to me that I found that interview and that statement reaching out, actually wanting to embrace that and to work with the Vatican in that regard. It's a city-state. I mean, it is, they engage in international politics. They're in the United Nations, and they're involved in all these international agreements regarding the Paris Accords and the environment. So to see them actually being embraced is really an interesting step forward. And I think that the China policy, which is very controversial in the Catholic Church and even among politicians, and we had a story in December in which that's the one thing that Nancy Pelosi criticized Pope Francis about in our interview with her, which is why I said that's a separate story. And it was like headlines, like she was very unhappy with the fact that she's let the Pope Francis cut a deal with the Secretary of State Paroline in order to allow she and the Chinese government to select the heads of the church in China. But the fact that Rubio brought this up raises some questions like, could that become a part of the debate? Could that be interesting? Yeah. And I will say, this again, back to that vision, of Zelensky and Trump in St. Peter's Basilica as they were going out for the funeral mass for Pope Francis. I still want this story from my reporters. How did that happen? I know how that happened. The Vatican diplomatic corps made that happen. Yeah. You can't tell me that they coincidentally showed up and chairs were right there. Yeah. This shows how talented they are in the Vatican diplomatic corps, and that may be something that Rubio identified.
Yeah. This whole conversation reminds me of something that I've said before, which is that the Catholic Church is kind of an equal opportunity offender. It does things to simultaneously make conservatives and liberals mad, and so it's its gift. I want to turn to questions from the audience. If you have a question, raise your hand. We'll bring a microphone to you. Questions are questions, not speeches. So let's start there. And we'll start right there and then come around here.
Thank you all for coming. My question.
Testing.
My question is for all three of you. And the question is, how do you feel about whether or not the federal government or state governments should have the ability to dictate policy, specifically religious policy, to local school districts?
They shouldn't.
Okay.
I would agree.
I think we're all in agreement about that. I hope this isn't gratuitous, but I'll add one additional thought, which is one of the things I think every educational institution from kindergarten through, Ivy League colleges has discovered is that if you take federal money, you're going to eventually find that there are strings attached
Yeah.
to that money, and that maybe you ought to think hard about that.
Yeah.
I'm just throwing that out there, you know. Others? Okay, so we'll go right there first, and then you after that.
So the first term for Trump administration, I was in Cairo. So I met the political officer in United States Embassy. She introduced herself as Catholics, and she was very harsh in criticizing Islam at that time. In the same year, 2017, when I met her, Pope Francis came to Al-Azhar in Egypt, and he was a peacemaker, and he was advising and trying to get everybody together about peace in Middle East. You mentioned the peace in the Middle East, so do you think the Pope Leo will be more relying or more progressive in this regard, pushing everybody to agree about something regarding the war in Gaza, or the Trump administration will be more relying or opposing Pope Leo?
James, Gaza?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you could find anything more assertive and demonstrative about the war in Gaza than what you've heard from both Pope Leo and Pope Francis. That it's been a continuous sort of come to a peace agreement, have a ceasefire, sort of enough is enough, and famously, of course, Pope Francis called the only Catholic church in the region every night at 7 o'clock in order to talk to the Italian Franciscan pastor of that parish that then recently was bombed by accident by the Israeli forces. So I think you find them wanting to be, and they even offered, you come, the Vatican has said you can have peace talks here if you want to have it, I think both for Ukraine and for Gaza. So whether that, but I personally don't think that has any sway, as far as I can tell, with the Trump administration.
Thoughts?
Well, I mean, I think, was it today that Pope Leo met with the president of Israel? So he's clearly making diplomatic efforts. It's impossible to predict who will be more forceful on that front. As we've discussed, I think Pope Leo has taken a very, maybe behind the scenes, he's more involved than he's been outspoken about, war and seeking an end to violence. But he's also, as you mentioned, spoken about the plague of gun violence, but he hasn't given any prescriptive policy measures as of yet.
Yeah. We'll go right here.
Thank you. So historically, as Christian denominations in the United States, Catholics have, seen some anti-Catholic sentiment. This was true. You could see it in the first Catholic president not happening until the 1960s, and the second one happening as recently as 5 years ago. I'm curious if you see differences, especially on the right, in how Catholics approach their political action in life, especially elected Catholics, in comparison to other Christian denominations, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant traditionally, and kind of where you see that heading, and how that's changed in the last 50 years.
Interesting question.
Well, I would say in the last 50 years, really it was the evangelicals, as identified by Jerry Falwell and others, who really became, and Ralph Reed and the so-called Christian coalition that came out were really at kind of the vanguard and the forefront in terms of trying to promote, conservative values, in terms of promoting, basically Republican causes. As a part of that initiative, I know that they tried to bring in also conservative Catholics, sort of particularly on the abortion issue, in order to propel that. I will say in the 60s, and maybe even the early 70s, Catholics were very involved in a lot of social justice, Catholic social teaching, the civil rights movement, the end of segregation and Jim Crow laws, marched with Martin Luther King, and opposed, many famously opposed the Vietnam War. We've been doing throwback pieces for our 60th anniversary, and we ran the piece about the conviction of the Berrigan brothers for burning for breaking into the civil service, the selective service office in Pennsylvania and setting on, or Baltimore, outside of Baltimore, setting on fire all these draft records. They ended up being, one was Jesuit, I think the other, may have been Josephite priests. They ended up serving time in jail for actually doing that. It's sort of a different era now. You don't really see that kind of activism, at least on the left. It's more maybe through statements. But I do think that with the appointment of more of Francis's bishops, and in terms of the cardinals he selected, tend to be more on the progressive side and more outspoken on some of those issues. So you may see some changes as that happens in the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops.
Yeah, I think what's unique about Catholicism is that you have the bishops' conference is over here, and they are outspoken when Catholic social teaching intersects with specific policies. But on the lay side, and there's no connection with lay Catholic activism, so that's something that's kind of distinct. The lay Catholic activism that I see, especially among young Catholics, tends to be pretty issue specific. So people tend to be very passionate if they're activist about a specific thing. I mean, abortion or immigration or asylum or so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's interesting to note that we were talking about this beforehand, that the rise of the religious right and the connection between evangelical Christians and the political system didn't really occur until 1980, when Ronald Reagan opened the door, went to Dallas during the campaign, the moral majority convention, and said, you can't endorse me, but I endorse you, and that sort of opened the door to something that really hadn't been seen before. In 1976, Jimmy Carter, the Democrat, was the evangelical Christian candidate. So in that sense, that movement on the non-Catholic evangelical part is relatively recent. It didn't exist until 1980. So I don't think that's the same thing we're talking about here, but it's kind of a willingness to bring the religious conversation into the political arena a little bit more than it had been previously in American history. Other questions? Right there.
Hi. A significant portion of this panel touched on the disparities about the consensus on immigration within the Catholic Church. So I was looking at the Pew Research Center's latest data on religious landscapes. And although 60% of the United States population that answered it said that they were Catholic, we're seeing an increase in the proportion of the whole of Catholics that are Hispanic. So right now it's 54% white, 36% Hispanic, and the number of white people who reported as Catholics dropped 10 percentage points since 2007, whereas the Hispanic population went up by 7 percentage points, and more than 4 in 10 US Catholics are immigrants or the children of immigrants. So when we are seeing an increase in the ratio of demographics that are particularly impacted by the immigration issue, how can that be further dealt with within the Catholic Church and the Catholic consensus, especially when, even though we are seeing more Catholic representation in Washington, the majority of them are white Catholics. They do not reflect the actual diaspora, the Catholic diaspora practicing in the United States currently.
Ashley, thoughts?
Well, certainly a lot of the growth in the pews in the Catholic Church in the United States has been driven by Hispanics, so it's a very salient question. But on the other hand, the Republican Party continues to make gains with Hispanics, despite the fact that its position and actions and policies on immigration have been not what you would think would be supported by Hispanics. I know a lot of Hispanics who are staunch Trump supporters, and they very much support his immigration policies. And that may be because many of them are under the protection of the law. But it's certainly a very interesting and vexing question, and it will be interesting to see as the Hispanic population in the Catholic Church continues to grow, whether or not that affects the way Catholics vote on the issue.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really hard question. When I took the job a year ago, I wanted to do a poll of Catholics in the 8 swing states. So I asked the smartest political guy I know, like, what do you think about doing a poll about the Catholic vote? And that was you, and you said there is no Catholic vote.
I did say.
We did the poll anyway, and it turned out...
My influence is awesome.
And the poll turned out to be very accurate in those 8 swing states in terms of the overall number. Yeah. And actually, I think if you look at the Catholic vote, it pretty much echoed what happened sort of, in terms of the main vote. And so I do think that it's E.J. Dionne who said there's no such thing as the Catholic vote, and it's never been more important than ever.
Right. Well, here we are having this conversation. So if I have time for one more question, we'll do this one right here. Yeah, let's do this one up here. I'm sorry, I'm just going to run out of time here. And if you could stand up, it's easier for people to hear. Thank you.
This is something that both of y'all kind of touched on. So you mentioned that the Conservative Party traditionally upholds the Christian beliefs. But I wanted to know, you mentioned as well that you think that the current administration is perhaps using those beliefs to maybe shift people towards a specific party, and I wanted to know if y'all had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think my point was really that the policies of the Trump administration have been detrimental to the Catholic Church as an institution. For example, many examples. One is that the elimination of USAID was devastating to Catholic Relief Services. Catholic Relief Services was saving people from hunger all over the world. And all they did was and they happened to be the #1 recipient of funds from the USAID, which has now been eliminated by the Trump administration. There are now people, we believe, starving and perhaps dying in the world because of those cuts. That's really more of an institutional thing. It may not be really about, as we're talking about doctrine. They also eliminated funding for Catholic charities, which was one of the biggest agencies at the request of the government beginning in the late 70s, early 80s, of resettling refugees who come to the country legally. They needed to be resettled in communities and find jobs and be able to make a living and have housing and food. Catholic Charities was one of the biggest supporters of that. So I think many of the policies are also affecting, I can tell you, of this mass deportation effort. I would guess that about 80% of the people who are being deported are Catholic, Roman Catholic. We now have Catholics fearful to go to Mass on Sunday. They will not go to church. We have, ample evidence of this because they're afraid that ICE is going to come get them. And we have an example of that in Washington, D.C., at the Shrine of the Sacred Heart in Columbia Heights, where ICE actually stood out in front of it and captured people, Hispanics, who were going to the Spanish Mass at Sacred Heart. We know from the bishop of San Bernardino, Riverside County, that the numbers are down in terms of the Hispanics who are going to Mass. I don't know how that could be more anti-Catholic of a policy than the Trump administration currently has.
So I'll give you the final word, Ashley. Conservative Catholic policymakers drive these policies.
Well, I would say on the flip side, the Catholic Church is the largest non-governmental provider of healthcare, education, and charitable services to the poor in this country. The right of the Catholic Church to even operate those institutions, whether it's Catholic hospitals, Catholic schools, has been threatened by what seems like decades now of attempts from the other political party to basically shut those down, whether it's attempts to force Catholic hospitals to perform procedures that violate Catholic beliefs and teachings, whether it's attempts to require Catholic schools to teach things or hire people that go against Catholic social teaching. So I think you would have a lot of people who on the other side would say they're grateful for policies, and I got to give President Trump credit on this, religious liberty policies that basically stopped attempts that would have shut all those institutions down.
Well, we're not going to resolve all this tonight, but we shed light, and I think that's both a really good thing and also what the Dole Institute tries to do. So thank you both for coming. Thank you for your conversation. Thank you all for being here and for really smart questions. And at some point down the road, we'll pick up the conversation there. So anyway, have a great night.